In today's video, let us talk about the economic conditions of our country. All records have been broken and our GDP has now reached the double digits. -20. Our country's GDP has hit minus. As I was saying, the GDP of our country has dropped to -23.9%, which is approximately 24%. More than 1 lakh cases of coronavirus are being reported per day, which is recorded in itself. If no other country of the world such a huge magnitude of cases are reported in a day, India has now become the worst country in this case. In such scenarios, students are being forced to go write JEE exams where there are no traces of social distancing and SOPs. The students have to put their lives at stake to write these exams. And at the same time, the economic conditions of the country are so poor that GDP growth rate has now become -24%, which is much worse in comparison with the rest of the developed countries. And our sold-off media is pulling out all the tricks up its sleeves to distract you. So let us talk about the economic conditions of the country today. As soon as these GDP figures were made public, government trolls were unleashed to distract you and fool you. Graphics went viral on social media that said that the growth rate in USA is -31%, in Canada -38.7%, and in Japan -27.8%. So obviously India was better off than these countries, and so India must have performed much better. It is all possible because of Modi ji, right? But that was a fake news. These government trolls were deliberately showing you fake news and were comparing wrong statistics to show that the India's position was better off. The data was alright, but comparison was wrong. The quarter-on-quarter GDP figures were being compared with the annualized GDP figures. When you compared them both at the same scale, just like the chief economist of the International Monetary Fund did, then you will see that the figures on a quarter-on-quarter, non-annualized basis for USA are -9.1% GDP growth rate, the figures of Europe are -11.7%, the figures of the Great Britain are -20.4%, and the figures of India are -25.6%. There is no doubt that among the major countries, be it developed or developing countries, India has been the worst performing country, and the reason behind that is pretty simple. The reason is not solely act of God or act of COVID-19, but also the act of fraud. I mean to say that economic conditions of India today is largely because of the prior decisions taken by this government. For example, demonetization, GST, and terrible economic policies, as well as bank frauds. Similarly, the second worst performing country among the G20 countries is United Kingdom. I am talking about the same comparison list. United Kingdom had a figure of -20.4%, whereas India had a figure of -25.6%. And the reason behind this is internal as well as the Brexit that has plugged the UK's economy for the past few years, has completely destroyed it. And this is why UK is the second worst performing nation. Barring exceptions like UK and India, the rest of the countries have seen a dip in GDP due to COVID-19 in the range of -7% to 11%. Brazil, Germany, USA have all seen a dip of -9%, 9% in Russia as well, whereas -7% in Australia. Coming back to India, how bad is economic state? The recording of quarterly GDP growth rate had begun in 1996. Prior to that, it was measured annually. Ever since then, this has been the worst quarterly performance. In case of annual performance, the worst GDP growth rate performance of India was seen in 1979 to 80 at -5.2%. The annual figures have not come in yet, but many experts believe that when they are released, conditions are going to be even worse than that. Going by this logic, you could say that ever since the country's independence, things have never been so bad for the economy under no government. What is surprising is that some experts are of the opinion that there is a fudging of data. The GDP growth rate figures in the last few quarters and the last few years have been exaggerated by the government, according to some experts and economists. Taking that into account, the same experts say that in reality, the GDP data today will be even worse than -30%. Conditions of unemployment are also bad. The top trend on Twitter is regarding unemployment every second day. But there is some good news. Unemployment had peaked 23% in months of April and May. In June, it has come down to 11%. But the job losses were in millions. If you observe the sector by sector breakdown of the GDP growth rate, then every sector has a negative growth rate except the agricultural sector, where the growth rate is positive. Experts believe that the extreme number of job losses caused the people to revert to the agricultural sector and farming, due to which a slight positive growth rate is visible. The people reverted to farming out of helplessness. According to an estimate by the World Bank, more than 12 million Indians will be pushed into poverty due to this crisis. Generally, when economy is in such a terrible state, the prices of goods do not rise. There is not so much of dearness and the inflation rate remains low. But the situation today is quite the reverse. They have been unable to achieve the upper limit set by the RBI RBI for inflation. Inflation was 6.9% in July, which is a bad news because people are losing their jobs. They have no money, but the prices of goods are rising. This does not happen normally. When all this data is put forward in front of the government and the questions are raised on it, then the government tries to distract you. Sometimes the situations are attributed to an act of God and sometimes they are said to be not so bad. But the fact that the situations are much worse than before. You can see the GDP growth rate of the last few quarters in graph from 7% to 6.2% to 5.6% to 4.4% to 3.1%. It kept declining steadily and today it has fallen into negatives. All of this had happened before the breakout of COVID-19, so not everything can be blamed on COVID-19. It is the decisions of the government that are making matters worse, because the government is busy with something else. In a situation when the people do not have enough money to spend, they lower their consumption, that is, they reduce their expenditure on things, and when consumption falls, the businesses do not invest that much, and has a bad effect on GDP as well as the economy. Many economists suggest a bailout for small industries, while some suggest that funding in schemes like Manrega should be further increased so that money is given in the hands of the people. It remains to be seen what decision will be taken by the government. Another suggestion is that the government increases its debt to GDP target ratio. Right now, it is 20%. If it is further increased, then the rest of the state governments would get the opportunity to spend more. The debt increases, but it would be okay, because people would at least be able to sustain in the short term. But here's one thing I would like to say. Today the GDP growth rate is so greatly negative that the base for the upcoming GDP growth rates in the future would become so low. Keep this in mind. The government would then try to claim credit of reviving the economy and getting the GDP growth rates back in the positives. The reason behind is it has fallen so low today that it is bound to come up because the lockdown is gradually being removed. And the lockdown was the major reason for the complete stagnation of the economy. But we will only get to know in the long term, that is, in the upcoming 2 years, if you notice the trend of the GDP growth rate and see that the economic conditions of our country is improving or deproving.